Fun fact, I use very little paint in my textured acrylic paintings. And I know you think that that can't possibly be true when you look at all this luscious color, but it is. I'm not using a whole lot of paint. And the reason why is because paint's expensive. Instead, what I do is I mix other stuff into the paint so that it's much more economical. And in this video, I'm going to tell you exactly what I do and how I do it so you can make your own. And by the way, if you're like, oh my gosh, I totally want to do this, please check the notes, the show notes, because I've got a supply list and another tutorial that's a little bit longer and more detailed. And I also have a course, and you can learn a little bit about taking my course if you're interested. And you will also see my studio cat, Cornnut, who becomes very curious about everything I do, and I have to work very hard to make sure that his tail does not drag against the wet paint or his little paws, because he does not like it. If I'm trying to clean his wet paint from in between his toe beans, he does not like that one bit. So here we have what I actually use. This is modeling paste or a gel medium. Those are the two. Sometimes I mix them together. Okay, so the reason why you would use a gel medium with your acrylic paint is because if you have decent quality acrylic, like in this case, I'm using Golden, which is my favorite as far as their color quality. A tube of Golden paint, which, I'd recommend using probably higher quality paint if you care about your work being archival, meaning it won't fade over time and also isn't likely to crack or melt. So I like Golden heavy bodied acrylic paint for most of my work because I trust the pigmentation and I know it's not going to fade. It's archival. I sell my work, so I want to make sure it looks as awesome in 100 years as it does today. So those are my goals. And I feel confident that our Golden as a paint supplier knows what they're doing. So I like to use those paints, and Golden paints are quite expensive. So I could spend a whole lot of money and get some really juicy texture with just the paints alone. But I found that I don't have to. And in fact, I barely use a teeny tiny bit of paint as I'm mixing it with my medium. And the ratio is like something like, it could be like 20-1, like 20 parts medium and 1 part paint. Because one of the things that happens, especially with gel medium, which is what I'm using here, is that it dries clear, which means right now it looks kind of frosted and whitish, but it doesn't dry that way. It dries quite a bit darker than you'd think. And so one of the things that I have to do is to compensate for that drying effect by adding a little bit of white paint, like literal white acrylic paint, just sort of stabilize the color, meaning it won't change quite as much. Because if I just use unmixed, say, purple paint or dark blue paint, it will look kind of like a pastel pink or pastel tint, but when it dries, it will get darker and darker and darker. And if I didn't expect that, if I didn't want that to happen, I can actually be quite disappointed because the paint just changes too much color. And for me, the paint color is one of the most delectable parts of this process. Like, I love the texture and I love the, kind of sensory experience of making what I call these paint beads or dragon petals. But the color is really where it's at. I like to do gradients and I like to just explore different kinds of color shifts, tint shifts, color shifts, various kinds of gradients. I often work in a spectrum, like a rainbow order, because it's just so satisfying to me. I don't get sick of it. I just like to do it over and over and over again. So you can see in this color mixing process here, I'm adding a little bit of white paint along with the medium. And then I am slowly adding more color as I go. And I call that the mother method. So what that means is I am leaving a little bit of the previous color on my palette. And then when I finish one line of color, then I'll add just a teeny bit of the next color. So I don't have to remix the whole mound. I can just be like, okay, now I want it to be a little bit more red. So now you're going to see I add more red, a little bit more white, again, to stabilize the color so it doesn't dry too dark, and a little bit more of that medium to plump it right up. And I can tell you a couple of other things as you're watching this process go down here. I'm using a disposable mixing palette. which is like a notebook that has a bunch of, it's kind of like wax paper. And the wax paper, you can, I'll use it for a single painting and then throw it away. And that helps because then I don't have to worry about paint getting all gunked up. And if you get gunky dried paint on your palette, it's really hard to get a smooth bead of your petals. So using a palette paper like this works very well. And by the way, I do have a longer tutorial than what I'm going to explain in this tutorial here that you can get for free. And I'll put the link in the show notes. You can also see my supply list, my Amazon supply list. And if you get on my mailing list, I'll also give you opportunities to buy my work. If you have any interest in owning a Josie Lewis original, I would be delighted and honored. And every couple months or so, I do a little shop update where you can get your own painting. But I also highly recommend that you make your own, although I think you will find that I make it look a little easier than it actually is. Because I've taught many, many, many workshops on how to do this process. And the number one thing that I hear from people that attend my workshops is, wow, this is harder than I thought. And really it has to do, color mixing, it can be really tricky. And also getting that bead of paint on the edge of my knife can be rather tricky. So that's what I teach more in detail inside my course, which I do have a course that has probably like 10 different lessons where I go in like great detail with all of these different steps. But what I'm telling you right now is probably enough to get going, and you won't have to you can at least try it on your own. And then you might find, oh gosh, I probably need a little bit more help from Josie, in which case I'm here for you. So you can check the show notes if you're interested in more. But in the meantime, I'm going to keep explaining this process. So I have a mixing palette that is the disposable palette that I'm working on, that I'm mixing my paint. I have a small diamond shaped trowel. There's tons of different size palette knives on the market. So many. And really a lot of it is just your personal preference, what size palette you like. I tend to like the smaller palette knife that just gives me these smaller petals. And sometimes I want to do bigger petals, in which case I'll use a bigger knife. But in this case, it's pretty small. And then I have my palette knife, and sometimes I'll have a few palette knives, like a bigger one if I'm mixing up bigger batches of paint. It's sometimes nicer to have a bigger palette knife. And you can buy like kits on Amazon or in art supply stores that will have like maybe 10 or 15 different shapes of palette knives, which fairly inexpensively. And that can be a fun way to like try different techniques with knives, because there's a lot of painters that only use knives, that never use paintbrushes. And it can be a really fun way to move paint around. So that's something you can consider. And then on my canvas there is actually not a canvas. It's actually a board. It's a panel, like a hardwood panel. So it has like a piece of MDF that's primed on the top. And then there's a cradle underneath that is kind of like stretcher panels, but it's instead of being attached to a canvas, it's attached to the hardwood board that goes on top. And I really like using that hardwood panel for a number of reasons. One is that it is a real sturdy structure. It doesn't boing around. And since I'm using quite a lot of medium and paint here, sometimes I worry that if I was using canvas and if it's not stretched properly, like sometimes those canvases that you can buy at the, Michael's or at the art supply store just aren't like super great quality. And they're okay maybe if you're just doing a more conventional, like flat, lighter painting in weight, like less heavy painting. But for what I do, I'm using so much material here with a lot of moisture that I like to have the most sturdy structure possible. And I do make sure it's primed, because what will happen, because there is so much moisture here, it can actually kind of warp. If you just use a piece of wood, for instance, a piece of masonite or, MDF or some other kind of hardwood from your garage, it could actually make it bend and warp and twist and that. So I like to use these cradled hardwood panels, and that's what's happening here. This piece itself is about 8 inches square. So as you can see, I'm moving along with my gradients, adding more and more colors as I go. And I love to play around both with color and value. So value is the lightness or darkness of a color. And the color, of course, the hue is where the position of the color on the color wheel. And what I do here is I work in spectrum order, like rainbow order. And I don't necessarily always start with a particular color. Like in this case, I started with purple. And then sometimes I start with yellow. And sometimes I don't have a strictly spectrum painting. I don't make my way all the way through every single color of the rainbow. Sometimes I just want to do analogous colors. And analogous colors are when the colors are very close to each other on the wheel. So if you can remember back to when you were looking at a color wheel, and there's the primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, and then the secondary colors, which like red and yellow mixed together creates orange, and those are the secondary colors. And then there's tertiary colors, and then of course, every possible color of the rainbow inside those broad categories. But sometimes I work in analogous colors. So if you look at my painting and you go from the purple corner to about like maybe the pinky or orangey color, those would be analogous colors. So they're very close to each other on the wheel. And sometimes I make color paintings like that. This one is pretty much going through the whole spectrum though, although I am playing quite a lot with value, meaning I'm making, instead of like a bright spring emerald green, I'm making kind of more of a minty green, like more of a pastel type green as I'm moving my way through this little arch. It's kind of like a half a rainbow that I have going on here. And that could be, this is like pure fun for me. This is like just so satisfying to work like this. It's so therapeutic to work with color this way and do this very methodical color mixing. And as you can see, I need more white. So I use quite a lot of white in this process, especially since I'm really playing with the value. So anyway, like I said, I have a whole course on this, and there's a couple of ways you can get it. If you want the course, you want to like really dive into this process with me, you can buy the course just outright, and then you have full-time, or you have lifetime permanent access to it. Or you can join. I have a subscription service called Art Heart Academy, and in Art Heart Academy, I have, I don't know, like 10 different courses that I've made over time that are acrylic and gel plate printing and watercolor and color mixing and a number of the other types of art things that I love to use and make. And it's very, very affordable. So we also do challenges regularly. So we can, there's a little community where we can make art together, and that's really fun. And like I said, super affordable. So if you want to check out more about my course or about my subscription service, that's Art Heart Academy, you can check the caption for the details. And then, of course, in the caption, I'm also going to have my supply sheet so you can see exactly what I'm using, as well as like an Amazon link so you can see, the materials that I use for this style of painting. And I hope you check it out. Please ask any questions that you have, and I will do my best to answer them in future episodes. Since I'm filming a few more of the long form videos, I was getting some requests to do longer videos where I can talk through this whole process in a little bit more detail. And so I'm very pleased to do that. Thanks for being with me today, and I'll talk to you again soon.